Well, here is a picture of an informal settlement in the Philippines. Now, this could be a picture that you would see in so many different cities. About 1 billion people live in informal settlements such as these. Imagine the needs that are unmet in an informal settlement such as this. But unfortunately, poverty in urban areas isn't measured by living standards, it's measured by income. And the income is set, it's meant to be set at the level that allows an individual or a household to afford basic needs, but it isn't. It's only based usually on food needs with a very small adjustment for non-food needs. But perhaps the most dramatic undercount of urban poverty comes from the dollar-a-day poverty line. The World Bank started using the dollar-a-day poverty line in the late 1990s. Now it's $1.9 per person per day. But this assumes that the cost of non-food needs is the same all over a country. You know, as if a small village in Uttar Pradesh has the same cost of housing, of water, of sanitation as being an informal settlement in Mumbai. This graph shows the dramatic difference in who is said to be poor, comparing the dollar-a-day poverty lines with national poverty lines. If you set the poverty line to the dollar a day, it shows a dramatic fall in poverty, and you see in this graph what might be regarded as evidence of huge success of development. But the dollar-a-day poverty line is so unrealistic for anywhere where the non-food needs of low-income groups are expensive. Now, there was a dramatic fall in the number of people living in slums in India, in Bangladesh, and in many other countries between 2000 and 2010. What seems to have happened is that they'd changed the criteria for what is adequate sanitation, making the standard lower. And that moved 60 million people out of slums in India. So it was a change in the statistical base, nothing to do with the number of people moving out of poverty. Of course, how you measure poverty influences the response. If it's only on the basis of income, then you look for additional income. But if it's on nutritional status, then you're looking for how to increase food supply. But what it ought to be looking at is the much broader living environment and the livelihoods. A lot of people are said to be living in poverty, but poverty definitions don't mention living conditions. If you're going to rely on income-based poverty lines, then you've got to find out how much non-food needs cost. You've got to look at the cost of housing. Many low-income groups are renting accommodation, and rent can often take 25 to 30% of their total income. You've got to see the amount spent on water. If the only access to water is water vendors or water kiosks, they're probably paying quite a high cost for water. You've got to look at the costs of sanitation. In many informal settlements, there's no room for toilets within each person's home. And what grows up are small commercial enterprises that give you access to toilets and washing facilities. Very often there's hidden costs of keeping children at school. There's the informal payments that teachers demand. There's school uniforms, there's school books. Cost on transport. If you are looking for cheap land and you go to a peripheral site in a city, you build in high transport costs, both in time and in money. In terms of the spatial aspects of poverty, obviously low-income groups concentrate in areas where housing is cheap, or there is no cost to housing, for instance on pavements, or some of the peripheral areas of cities where the commercialized land market hasn't yet caught up. But in general, low-income groups, their priority is to live within easy reach of employment opportunities. Now, the only land that's available that's within easy reach of employment opportunities is usually riverbanks or watersheds or places that are dangerous. So you get enormous concentration of low-income groups in informal settlements in dangerous sites. The low-income groups that want to build their own homes often look for land on the periphery. But the most affordable land is the land that's least well suited to accessing labour markets. So you have lengthy and expensive commutes, even if your housing is cheap. And of course, we've also got to look at those who are particularly susceptible, particularly at risk. So we've got to look by age. Infants and young children are particularly vulnerable to a range of diseases and injuries. Obviously by sex, obviously by gender. Perhaps also by particular groups that face discrimination within the urban poor, particular ethnic groups or migrants. So urban poverty is complex, so many dimensions. so important to incorporate different groups. So how do we actually measure it? One of the most important innovations in urban poverty was a recognition that it has many dimensions. So it wasn't just based on income or on consumption, but it was based on a safe site, a reasonable house, access to water piped to your home, a proper toilet, drainage, the collection of household waste, access to healthcare, access to schools and childcare, a registered address. In many countries, you need a registered address to get on the voters' register. Policing, so many informal settlements have no policing. The police simply ignore them. The rule of law implemented. All of these are critical aspects. A deficiency in these can be judged to be part of poverty. The difficulty is, of course, that these are more difficult to measure than income or consumption. The other worry is that you need to treat each of these deficiencies separately. There's an index that has been developed, the multidimensional poverty index, that aggregates most of these aspects. And as you aggregate, so you lose any understanding of what's happening. Unfortunately, most of the data on poverty is done from national sample surveys. And national sample surveys have sample sizes too small to inform each locality on the deficiencies in provision for basic services or the poor quality housing. Censuses should provide this, but it's unclear that censuses necessarily cover all informal settlements. And it's also difficult for local governments to get the data out of census authorities in a form that allows them to look at provision for water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools, down to each street. What we need is not national statistical offices, but statistical offices that serve local governments as well as national governments with relevant data. We asked grassroots leaders from 6 Asian nations to talk about how they would define and measure urban poverty. And they took this very seriously. They went back to their communities and, like good researchers, did large household surveys. But household surveys done by community leaders that really knew what the cost of food and of non-food needs was. And what they did is they came back with a definition of urban poverty that was much tighter, an understanding of urban poverty that was much more specific. And we are encouraging them to go to their national statistical offices and say, look, we're the experts in poverty. This is how we measure and monitor them. Please learn from us. If we look at the solutions highlighted by the grassroots leaders, community savings was obviously important. Urban poor groups taking initiatives themselves, trying out things. When things work well, then go to government and say, let's multiply this 100-fold. Urban poor groups also gathering the data on urban poverty, more accurate, more detailed, more useful than official definitions. Linking their work in networks and federations so that they have more power to influence what the state does. Obviously getting land or tenure of the land they already occupy, but being able to address their own housing issues and then upscale their work in partnership with local governments.